Well, hello there, and welcome back once again to the Sage's Library. I am, as always, your intrepid sage, Trevor Duval. Today, we have a very special episode of the Sage's Library, as it is, in fact, part two, sort of. This is a companion video to the video on Harn that I already released up here. You can go and check that one out. This video is a discussion with one of the principal producers of Columbia Games, Grant Dalgliesh. We sat down and talked about all things Harn, including details about the Kickstarter, which they have going on right now. The link for that is in the description below if you want to help support that project. So, without further ado, here is the Sage's Library, Harn Part the Second. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of Harn and all that kind of stuff. But before we get into that, I just want to say that I think Harn is one of those early settings that, for me, because I was very young in '83, I was 11 years old, but I remember when I saw the ad in Dragon magazine for it, and I was immediately hooked by it because there was the map, right? There was the map of Harn, and there was the hex map of, I think there was a part of Kaldor in there or something. And I was just immediately transported to it. But when I bought the supplement, and I have the first edition box sitting in my library, which is a treasure to have. But I remember as a kid looking at Harn and going, I don't understand this, because it was such a wonderful medieval simulator, and at that time, as an 11-year-old boy, I was into D&D and dragons and sending rings into fire against the Dark Lord and all this stuff, and I didn't understand that setting. It took me like another 25 years when I saw it again to go, oh, I know what this means. So if you had to sort of talk about like the lure of Harn as opposed to other settings, what might that be?
Well, the depth of the world, the way the information that has been provided about the world over all these decades in a lot of different books, from a high level, things like the planet and its relation to the sun and other planets in the solar system and its moon. Things like the plate tectonics and the prevailing winds and ocean currents, and then down a notch to the continents on the planet, and then down a notch to the island of Harn, where we have chosen to focus. And you go down from there. I'll come back to that. But the first thing, I call it the zoom, a top level zoom in from the highest level, like the universe, all the way down, and eventually all the way down to the individual residents of a particular city, with biographies and floor plans of their buildings or hovels, and the consistency that exists from that highest level all the way down to the lowest level is fairly unique. It's a technical thing in that the Harn map, as you mentioned, has hexes on it, and those hexes have been drawn at a closer scale on our Atlas map series, and it always corresponds. Like the hex, what's in the hex at one scale is going to be in the hex at the next scale down, and so on and so forth. And you can go all the way down, and it kind of always holds together. The scale and the concept all holds together. So that's one sort of special thing about Harn. It's presented as a real world with an atlas and encyclopedic type information, as if you were researching and studying the real world. In addition to stuff like the geography and the structure of the whole world, Harn was designed specifically for role playing. So in order to potentially capture as many different styles and allow people to use Harn in almost any way they wanted, the place called Harn, which is an island, and again, we focused on that for most of the 40 years of Harn, developing that island and the people that live on it, the cultures, and the different cultures is where I'm going here, because in the north of Harn, there's a culture of Vikings that in recent times in Harnic history subjugated, conquered the people who live there, and they are occupying. And if you are interested in role playing in a Viking type environment, you can be involved in that. You can go on the other side of that. There's the people that are beleaguered and suppressed by those Vikings, and you can be involved in them. And that's just one style. In another region, there's a succession crisis brewing in a feudal kingdom, and you can be involved in that. In another one, religion is a much more pervasive. Religion is important across all of Harn, but in some areas more than others. Um, there's also a culture of elves. They're Tolkien-esque elves, and dwarves also
Very
Tolkien-esque.
Tolkien-esque. Like it's pretty explicit in the literature that they are literally elves from Middle Earth who, on the way to
Yeah,
the west, kind of stopped off in the world of Harn, from what I recall.
yeah, yeah. And so all of those things are setups, right? So that a player or game masters can join in any particular part of this world and fit into it, and yet it still operates kind of independently. And we've explained the history. That's a really important thing that isn't often covered in role playing. It's a very detailed history has been written about Harn, about the island, about the people who live there now, and how those kingdoms or regions came to be the way they are. That's a history of conquests and wars and things of that nature. And it goes all the way back through uh, thousands of years, and it's quite detailed. And then we deliberately stop. And this is another interesting hallmark of Harn. So we've written the history up until the year 720 in Harnic time, and there's a calendar on Harn. Uh, it's got its own months and a year, which is deliberately designed as 360 days, and the months are deliberately 12 30-day months. And Robin Crosby did some stuff like that for the sake of familiarity, so that it's just a little easier to role play with some things that you can assume. Uh, Other things like that is that there's one sun and one moon and 24-hour days
Can I jump
and
in on there,
things
because I
like
think
that.
that is a hugely important thing. The thing that I always loved about Harn was that it was clearly a fantasy version of England. It was clearly a fantasy version of Europe, but it was still a fantasy version of it. But it was still, as you say, familiar enough. There were things that were in that world that were familiar enough to make you feel like, I recognize this place. It isn't some alien world with a bunch of crazy, well, like you say, there's only one sun, there's only one moon. If you have a world like the Forgotten Realms, I mean, that can get very gonzo because it's all over the place. But the thing that I found about Harn, as you say, the history is so detailed, it really makes you feel like this is a living, breathing world, that all of this stuff really, really happened. And when you delve into that
Really
history,
happened.
yeah, it's consistent, just like the map is consistent, the history is consistent too. And
Yeah.
also the idea about stopping at 720 TR which
Mm-hmm.
is the year. That is also something I think that's very important that you hit on, because that is a huge, huge, huge difference from virtually every other fantasy setting out there, because
Yeah.
you guys don't have to worry about any meta plot interfering with people's personal campaigns, because from that point on, it's up to each GM to
Well,
fulfill the history of the world.
it feels like it's more of an honor to the GMs that we're not going to contradict what they develop for Harn. But by writing up until the year 720, there's so many things that are about to happen.
Yeah.
And in each of those different regions that I mentioned, and more, like a succession crisis that is overdue because there's an ailing king, and this
With
is
no
the realm of
air. Yeah.
Gabor. And this has been gamed out many, many times. I've played it. I played it in a LARP at Gen Con. It's great fun to see how that goes down. The king dies in our version that we're playing in that convention. The king dies, and there are some power brokers that struggle to make a case for themselves. And playing in a LARP, we got to adopt all these characters, and it was high level. Like somebody was the king's son or his different sons, and others were earls, and so we played that out, and it went down, and somebody got chosen as a successor. It could have also broken down into an actual war.
Right.
And I know that particular scenario has been gamed out hundreds, maybe thousands of times by groups at conventions and just privately throughout the world, throughout all the 40 years of Harn. And then just significant that we never said what happens.
Right. And you never will. I mean, at least that was the claim before. And I think that's fantastic because in so many worlds, I mean, again, I come back to the Forgotten Realms just because that's the one that most people are aware of because of the popularity of D&D 5th edition and stuff like that. But in the Forgotten Realms, if you look at the difference between what that world was from the Gray Box edition, which was the very, very first edition back in the early 80s or mid 80s, versus to what it became in 3rd edition versus what it became in 4th edition, these were utterly different places. Even the maps changed, and that drove me nuts because I was like, I no longer recognize this place. And the thing about Harn was that I always knew that I could come back to it at any time, and it would still be the Harn that I know. You know, which is, I think it's a huge boon to the setting.
Yeah, it is something that a decision that was made early on, and I guess it was easy to honor that decision and stick to it, and it turned certainly into a boon that it's a place that you can count on. Join in, and then maybe leave it alone for a while. Come back, it'll still be there.
Yeah, and what I found too over the years is on the Harn forums and stuff is that overwhelmingly people are extremely respectful of each GM's P-Harn, either their personal Harn, right? And I love that. I love that community is so passionate. They share this common history and this common geography and this common group of cultures from the island of Harn. But each GM's campaign is going to go off in radically different positions, but they can all talk about it with equal passion because they share that common starting place.
Yeah, it's for history buffs, which I am and my father is, and Robin Crosby was, and all of us involved are actual history buffs, right? And much of caring about history or thinking about history is what if, right? We spend almost all of our time outside of, you read something and then you ask yourself, well, what if that had happened instead? Or what if it happened later or differently? And so that's what P-Harns are, the what if, that any individual game master came up with, and essentially defending your what if, storytelling what happened, and that it's going to be an exercise in is it plausible, and that's what people discuss.
Yeah.
You know, I think they get to debate the plausibility of what happened in terms of comparing and contrasting with their own experiences.
Yeah,
it's really neat. It's something kind of special,
and it's clearly all of you guys are students of history, because the thing that blew my mind wide open in Harn was when, like I said, when I first saw it as a kid, so I was like, where's Mount Doom? Where do the hobbits go to throw the ring at? But it took me till I was in my 30s to go, oh my God. And one of the things that did it was when I re-looked at Harn, I started reading the Orbal supplement, which is the northern Viking-dominated area, and I pronounce it Yarn, but it could be Jarn. I'm not sure what the official pronunciation is, but I call it Yarn. The Yarn people up there, as I started to read and really delve into the details of the Orbal supplement, I started to realize, oh my God, I know what this is. This is a parallel of the English in Ireland. And there's a group, the Angaisa, which are a Yarn resistance, which they're the IRA, man. And I was looking at this going, oh my God, this is a reflection of our own world. And only people who truly are looking for it are going to find that stuff. And that, I think, is the thing I found with Harn the most, was that if you really start to read between the lines, the adventure leaps off the page. Because as a kid, I didn't see what the adventure was. I was like, how is it? You're a bunch of peasants doing agriculture work? How is that? But when you read between the lines, boom, it's like, look at all the possibilities here.
Yeah, well, the possibilities are endless. You can be peasants, and that can be interesting in the agriculture itself. we've provided enough detail that that can be interesting. Some of the challenges of just managing
A
a
fief,
manor.
yeah.
We have a whole book about manor and manorial
Hmm.
economics and things that also really can become fascinating. Uh, but it is a grown-up stuff. Kids do not tend to quite get the nuance, and that's okay. I mean, we have our niche, and the history fans fit in that niche. Another one is anyone who's ever designed their own world, um, and then finds out about Harn. One of the first thoughts goes through their minds is, I can use this for
Hmm.
my world. And so sometimes they end up taking parts of it. You can take a city from Harn and stick it in a world somewhere else if you want. It's modular in that sense. But usually after a while, you might find yourself asking questions about, well, why is that city there where it is,
Yeah.
and who controls it? And you might read about the kingdom and then end up just sort of figuring this has all been done for you. And uh, people that tell us stories about the worlds they've created, uh, they get pretty excited when they see some of the things that we've covered that they didn't even think of sometimes, or
Yeah.
that they just dreamt of thinking of, like weather patterns and there's just so much. It's a real world. It's
It is, and the thing, I know a lot of people that I've spoken to over the years were a little put off it at first because what they saw was this deeply simulationist environment for a game. Oh my God, there's rules for daily weather, and there's all this stuff. But I'm like, okay, first of all of that is optional. You can completely ignore it if you want. It's up to you. It's your damn game. But the other thing is that once you start to go down that road and you start to see how each piece does fit perfectly together, as you say, you can pull a city right out of Harn and plop it in your world, but it's it's not going to feel right in the context of that greater world because the city is so perfectly designed to work with itself and with its surrounding environment that you're really kind of doing yourself a bit of a disservice by not using the rest of the world to go along with it, I think. Um,
so it's a Trojan horse then for us
yeah,
as
essentially, yeah. Now, Harn, one of the things that really turned me onto it as well was as an adult when I picked it up again. I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia, which, of course, for you Americans,
that's
that would be
home.
considered the Pacific Northwest. But what that means is it's a temperate rainforest. So you get a ton of rain in the winter. Everything's very green and lush. Tall mountains and pine trees. So what I felt about Harn was that Harn was this beautiful melding of rural England and historical England and the west coast of North America. Is that on purpose, or was that just my impression of it? Because it seems to me that how Robin designed it was very specifically, there's areas in Harn that clearly this is a west coast environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would have been a natural thing for him to do, and he thought about a lot of things that are above and beyond the the weather patterns on a daily basis is one thing, and whether or not you're interested in caring about that as a player or a game master is another thing. But it's there for background. But at the bigger level, where the prevailing winds are and the ocean currents are was mapped, and so too are the mountain ranges, for example. And where there's a mountain range, there's rain on one side and a rain
Mm-hmm.
shadow on the other, and these are all things that are well known from real geography on Earth, and similar on our new series of maps, the Atlas maps, which are zoomed in one notch from the main Harn map, hex by hex. And we have contour lines
Mm-hmm.
showing very technical, the 500-foot elevation line all everywhere. And then where there are rivers and creeks, they follow the logic that you would expect. The contours bend around them. And as that gets expanded, we and our mapping people, we're adding things effectively. I mean, the little streams and creeks and stuff just aren't illustrated until now, or when a map section is done. But then as we do it, we apply all that same process and map it so that it's believable and consistent with what's been said and done and mapped. And so it's an ongoing 40-year project, and another 40 years. Let's hope.
So,
And
in terms of that, you guys have got the new edition coming out. It's not really a new edition. It's a hardcover version
yeah,
of the Atlas and the, I don't even know what you guys are calling it now. It used to be called the Harn decks and the what were the terms? I forget.
Harn World and Harn Decks were the
Right.
two parts that came from the original box module you referred to all those years ago.
Right.
And they were updated a few different times over the years. And this is the newest, latest version with the hardcover format. It's going to be gorgeous, full color. But yeah, it never changes. Like what we did change is add more artwork, more color, more maps, but it's still the same place.
Yeah,
And
the first edition, the one that I have, of course, is the art is pretty sparse, and again, that's not a knock on it. It's just the way things were. But it's got sort of those woodcut pictures, which I thought was great. For me, that painted an atmosphere. But yeah, the new versions that you guys released since now, it's got full color illustrations, and I noticed too that when you get into the Kingdom modules, you're still keeping everything the same, but you're adding way more detail when it comes to the personalities of these figures that have been mentioned. Like
right,
a certain earl or a baron or something. Well, now you'll have more details about, maybe what they look like or what their immediate desires are.
right. And so some of the effort that's involved in doing that is, first you have to research what's been said about that Earl in a previous book, and it might just be one paragraph. And now we're going to add some more: his genealogy, his family, what he looks like, and definitely some motives, something akin to what drives him or her, and if it's and the that sets up stuff. So, but it's an interesting process. We sort of have to work quite hard to do a consistency check for everything that gets done.
I'll bet.
But we do have a team of people that do that, and it's easier than it ever was with computers to search for things.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's a great process. It's actually it's like when you're doing real history from back in college, and you had to write a paper, and you can't make stuff up. You have to follow what's history, right?
Yeah.
And find your sources and cite them and all that. It's sort of like that.
Yeah.
To do something these days.
I ran two campaigns in Harn. One was in, again, I have my own pronunciations of things, but the Kingdom of Chibisa, right, south of Kaldor there. And another one was a Yarn resistance campaign in Orbal against the Vikings. But having all of not only the maps, and oh my God, the maps, so beautiful. All of these, as you say, you scale right down to a tavern map, and it's got very technical details, so you know exactly which way the door opens and what quality the lock is, and it's just fantastic. But running a campaign, which was very Game of Thrones, because I was reading Game of Thrones at the time, I think for the first time, or HBO had just come out with the series or whatever the case, but I was full on Game of Thrones. So my Harn campaigns were extremely, George R. R. Martin approved. Lots of courtly intrigue and knights killing each other in terrible ways and stuff like this. But when I looked at the Kingdom of Japisa, as you said, this entire world, this entire game supplement is set up. It's a series of setups. It's a series of, we're going to give you this incredible history, and now we're going to put everything on the precipice. What do you do with it? And that is so rich as a GM, as a game master, to see a world where it is littered with adventure hooks on every page. You can look at any village or any smaller town, and you can look at little things like, oh, well, the lord of this town, he lives at this castle. There's a map of the castle. Oh, wait a minute, one of his retainers disappeared last year, huh? And boom, it's just. Suddenly there's all this stuff. So more than anything, more than any other world I've ever seen, the consistency of the history and the and the just the story hooks that are just waiting to be seized upon. I really think do to set it apart. So going back to the beginning of the world, um, Robin, when he designed it, did he design a Harn Master at the same time, or were those two separate projects, or how did that come to be?
They were separate projects. Harn was conceived initially as a system agnostic world where you could play with whatever you were currently playing with.
Which it still is, right?
And absolutely, absolutely. There was some pressure though from our fans to. They said things like, "Give us some rules as good as this world," um, and Robin had his homebrew rules that he called Harnmaster, and we developed them into a game. And my dad and Robin worked together on that, and it's its own cool thing.
Are there any plans? Are there any plans to do another edition of the game? Because Harnmaster is still in third edition, technically, isn't it? Isn't that the?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, a fourth edition. It's a fairly big project, so we don't have an exact timeline on it right now. I would say it's at least a year away, but that's also there's not a super huge motive. It doesn't need to change.
Right. Don't why fix what isn't broken?
Yeah, we'll pretty it up another notch as we do each time. We always improve a little bit, but it's like you said, if it's not broken, it's probably fine. And Harnmaster is a special, wonderful thing. It fits very well with Harn because you're already in a gritty, realistic environment. So we could add some gritty and realistic play, but you don't have to. You can play Harn in a very high fantasy mode. I've actually seen also at Gen Con a game that was absolutely as high fantasy as you can get, where all the players were wizards, and they were powerful wizards, very powerful. And I think the story was there was a renegade, a wizard who went a little rogue, and in Harn, some of the lore suggests that wizardry is something that you would probably want to keep under the table and subtle, because fireballs in the city streets are not conducive to a long life. Harn has been pegged as low magic, and I think it's not quite accurate. A proper term, in my mind, is magic rare.
Right.
It's just rare, and it's again up to you as the game master and the player how rare.
Right. And to address that as well, it's if you want to do a high fantasy version of Harn, you can, because you guys have filled it with those possibilities. I mean, there is theoretically a living god in the middle of the island who is producing all of these monsters. Now, is it really a living god?
That's a monster factory.
It's a monster factory, right?
You can use that to run any kind of monster-rich campaign that you want. You can invent a new creature with that. There's a plausible thing there, and then we put in a clever little thing. Because again, one of the things that's special about Harn is it's a world designed for playing. So things were thought about, again, like that thing about the assumptions of making things a little bit Earth-like. Another beautiful kind of control that exists in the game, in the world, is that monster factory, which is called Araka Kalai, and it's in the middle of Harn, and the god that lives there is the god Ilver. The creatures he creates, that's the idea, is the god creates the creatures, he gives them a name, and they're called Ivashu as a group. There can be any different variety of them, really almost absolutely anything can be an Ivashu. They're sent out into the world by Ilver, the god, but they're always unable to breed. They cannot breed. So perhaps they go out in the world and an adventurer, quote unquote, kills them. Then their soul, the monster's soul, goes back to this Araka Kalai, and Ilver can reuse it. And so there's a built-in finiteness to this, a control, and a game master can use it to any level they want. There's no rules or anywhere have we said how many souls or how the recycling of souls actually works or anything like that. But we've set it up so that you have a plausible way to introduce a finite amount of creatures. And there's again, plausible is one of my favorite words for describing Harn, right? It helps make it feel like a real story. But the Monster Factory would allow, again, the highest fantasy you can imagine. Anything could come out of that. So we could have high-level wizards and high-level monsters, and we've got elves, and we've got dwarves, and we've got orcs. And just because we have more information about all of those things and a culture and a kind of a grittiness to what's going on in their world doesn't mean that that forms any actual limit on what a group of people or characters could do.
Yeah.
And that to me makes it as flexible as you can get. You're grounded in a world that's there, and you can come and go into it and out of it, sort of, and it'll still be there. It'll still flow along independently of the characters. So it's kind of not inherently character centric. What I guess traditional kind of role playing is character centric, right? It is, we're the party and we're all that matter. We're marching around. Nothing else matters anywhere. But
well, it's very it's speaking from my own experience in my Harn campaigns. Yes, of course, they are the protagonists. They were the main characters, quote unquote. They didn't have any plot armor. I don't run that way. But their significance in the environment that they're in was only worth as much as what that environment was able to provide them in the first place. So if, like, one of the characters was this knight to this marcher lord way out in the on the borderlands, basically, and they were broke and poor and they had nothing and they were constantly under threat from the Gargan, which of course are the Harnic orcs. But it was entirely, their specialness as characters was completely integrated into the setting. They weren't special because they were some super awesome power. They were special because he was the second bastard son of this lord in the city who used to advise the king, and there's all that backstory. So their importance becomes important as integrated with the setting, and that kind of detail you can only have if you have a setting that is already providing it in the first place. Otherwise, the GM has to do all the work himself.
Right, and you struck upon something there that's really, really important: is the relationships, the feudal system, the concept of who's your liege. That's been spelled out in Harn. Like I mentioned, that ailing king in the kingdom of Kaldor, and it's all spelled out which earls and which barons owe fealty to that king, and then underneath those barons are manors, and manors are held by knights, and those knights, every single one of the manors has been named. The name of the guy who runs it has been given. Sometimes it's like a family relationship. Other times it's not. And sometimes we've developed it, and sometimes we haven't. But the name is there, and so you, as the game master, you now know if you want to take over the action at that manor on the borderlands, like you described. You now know plausible, believable reasons why you're going to do what you're going to do, because you're connected to the rest of the world by culture, by feudal obligation. And then it's different in Tharda. Tharda is a region in Harn that's a republic.
Right, it's like Little Rome, basically.
Like a little Rome, and it used to be an empire. So it's sometimes, a simple analogy is Rome in reverse. Goes from empire to republic instead of the opposite. So now you have a patrician class, a senate, things that are associated with republics existing in this region, and right next to it are two feudal kingdoms, um, Retham and Candé, and each of those have their own issues. But you've got all these different types of people, and you can get, as a player or game master, be involved in any one of them. So if you like Roman history, go play in Tharda, and you'll be amazed how that becomes interesting. And there's also a whole lot more. Harn is a little island. It's bigger than Britain, but not that much bigger than Britain, and it is beside a great big continent that's called Lithia, that's big like Asia is. And Lithia, we've mapped Lithia, and we've got an index of the settlements on Lithia, and that's included in the Harn World hardcover that is on Kickstarter now. That is a huge continent, though, and just throughout it are a whole bunch more cultures that they're somewhat analogous to Earth cultures. So there's a desert area where you have more nomadic peoples. There's a region where there are loosely Oriental ninja type things going on. And that is not detailed like Harn, but it's there. And so it's possible that a traveler from that realm could show up on Harn,
right,
or vice versa.
Now,
take a big Marco Polo type trip or something.
Right. Now, speaking of that, when you look at Lithia in relation to Harn, as well as Avinia, which is the Scandinavia equivalent, again, it's very, very clear that this is Europe, that this is, like Trierzon and all those places. That's France and the Holy Roman Empire. It's all implied. It's never, you don't come out and say it, but it's clear when you just look at the map. Yes, it's like Earth through a lens, darkly a little bit, right? But what I find interesting, though, is that the naming conventions of the world have nothing to do with those cultures. When you look at the names in Harn, at first glance, it's like, what is this? Doesn't there's no frame of reference. It's not like Hollybrook and Lord's Bridge and things like this. They're their own thing, right? So it's not, you don't get roped into this idea that, oh well, Harn is clearly England, even though it's very clearly England. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I'm always a little put off when maps have things like the boiling sea or the red plains or something just so
the mountains of death.
We could do better, folks. So every manor in the Kingdom of Kaldor, and there's hundreds of them, has been named, and that those names are all Harnic. They're unique. They're made up, of course, ultimately, but they're unique, and it's from there, though, right? When we get down and draw the map of the manor, and maybe we do it someday, maybe the game master does it himself, and maybe there's a hill nearby, and maybe that hill will be named after the manor, something like that. But the culture and the language, it's definitely meant to feel like it's original. So there's nobody named Johnson or Smith, or we don't use Earth names because it jars you when you read such a thing. So it's all original, and there is a structure. There's a structure to language. There's a script. There's a whole lot of things. There's even a font.
Harnic, a font. It's its own language. Theoretically, you could spend time to learn how to write in Harnic if you really wanted. Or Lakizi, I guess, is the
Lakizi is the script. Harnic is the language. There's a history of the languages. One of those charts that shows the history of language.
Yeah,
and I've seen it in how we get from Old English to Middle English to all that, and it's we've got that. And it's all original for Harn, leading to Harnic in the Harnic area. But there's other languages, and it's a big thing. It's all thought through as best as we could, and every time we think of something new, we find a way to blend it into what we already got.
Right.
Uh,
To maintain that consistency, which is great. So what is next for Harn? You guys have the big hardcover coming out in June, I believe you said. Is that right? What's
yeah,
next for Harn?
we're working on a series of hardback books that for each kingdom, and there are 9 of them on Harn. And we started down that road. We got 4 done so far. People are raving about them, so we're certainly going to press through that whole series. That's going to keep me busy all year, and maybe a little into 24. Um, we did Harn World because it's our core product, and we want to present it in its best light. Um, and after a couple of years off, I'm going back to Gen Con with the pandemic. We didn't go for a while, but now we're going back this August. I'm super excited to have that Arnold book and all the kingdoms. There'll be maybe 6 of them available by then. Um, and so we'll be working on that. We do a quarterly product we call it HarnQuest. HarnQuest is the name of the subscription. And every 3 months or so, we send out to our subscribers some new stuff. And it's a potpourri or a mixed bag of stuff. So the last one that we just came out with contained an article about a castle in Ivinia, a keep in Ivinia called Freuheim.
Mm.
It had an article about the Courtesans Guild, and you guys can look that up, learn about what courtesans are. And there's another one about weapon crafters, the guild. And guilds is something that Harn, because we've talked about this world, right, and these relationships, and I mentioned feudal and liege type stuff. Well, there's also guilds and economic relationships. And guilds, the simplest translation for guilds are early monopolies and early trade unions and systems. So that there's again a whole plausible system and a story, right? You go into the village or the city and you find out that so and so is working without the guild's sanction, and there's a story there about how the guild is maybe going to come and police it. And so these are things that, like an economic story that you don't see all the time, but there it is. And from there, you can take it a lot of different places. It can devolve into a big fight, or you can work it out. But yeah, so the last HarnQuest that came out had 2 guilds and a place in Avinia, and it's kind of a mixed bag like that all the time.
It sounds a bit like the old, was it Harn Lore? Was that the old magazine?
Yeah, we had Harn Lore before that, another one, same idea, called Encyclopedia Harnica.
Oh, right. That's right. That's right.
Goes back to the original time period. And so these days we release these HarnQuests with 2 or 3 or 4 different parts to them. And the HarnQuest is actually a bundling with a discount built in for the subscription, and a big perk as a subscriber where you get half off of any PDFs. That's the main perk. But then you get these new things in the mail or in PDF, and it's kind of a surprise. I mean, we'll tell you what's coming, but it's like you're collecting, and every so often you get something new, and it has the effect sometimes of inspiring and sending maybe your campaign off in a new direction, putting some fresh life into something. It's also just really good reading. Like, all of it is just good reading. And in truth, there's a lot of people that don't have an active campaign going right now, but they still love it. They still live in Harn. They still passionate about it.
Well, it's easy to do with the level of detail that you guys have put into the world. Certainly, it's been one of my, as I said, one of my favorite campaign settings of all time. I'm really looking forward to this new hardback that you guys are doing. I'm looking forward to all of the new stuff you're doing, and I'm looking forward to eventually getting back to Harn at some point. I'm too embroiled with other worlds and games at the moment, but Harn is always one of those places that I will always return to. So thank you so much for doing this, and thank you and your whole company for continuing to produce this world and this game, because it's one of the best out there as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I appreciate that, the accolade and the kind words. It's over the time period, it's been a battle for sure to keep it alive and thriving. I've gone through some ebbs and flows, but it feels like we're on the ascendant. We got got it dialed in pretty good now. A good team of people and a good future, a bright future. And yeah, Harn will still be here when you are ready for it. That's
Excellent. That is good news. Thanks so much, Grant, and thank all of you guys for watching. And we will see you next time on Me, Myself, and I.